Gold Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, our tour guide for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns of British Columbia, Washington State. We've hurtled into Alberta occasionally. Back in the southern part of BC today, an area which the Similkameen Valley is a favorite of mine, but where to specifically today?
Well, we're really in the south part of the Similkameen, Mike, and this is the crossroads of the Similkameen. So we're in the desert country, and where the Similkameen River drifts down and Keremeos Creek joins it, old Indian campsite. Some of the first white settlers were actually Hudson's Bay men, like the Richters. Then Barrington Price came in, and Barrington Price was a very well-known guy, an English aristocrat, kind of out of place. And a lot of those families that settled there, Mike, are still there. The McCurdy's and the Colemans and the Monaries and the Lawrences, all in this area. They've been there for 100 years, a lot of these families. And it's kind of a fascinating area. And we are talking really about Keremeos, Upper Keremeos, and Keremeos Center. So we're talking about the three sites of Keremeos, two of which have vanished. Yeah. One is still there. Yeah. And by the way, these photographs, most of them were provided by Billy Estabrooks of Summerland, and we're very, very thankful for that. And we got some other information from Dick Coleman and some of those old-timers in that area.
That's right. Great to still be able to talk to many of those people. That's where the history comes from.
Billy Estabrooks, who will probably be watching this program, rode the stagecoaches that we will see in this program.
Excellent. The three Keremeoses when we come back after this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee. We're talking about the three Keremeoses today. Yep. Well, let's start with number one, I guess, the best place to go. How did it begin?
Start with number one, and number one was Upper Keremeos. And it really begins with a guy called George Kirby. And George Kirby was interesting. He was in the Kelowna area, decided to drift south through Penticton, ended up in the old ghost town, what was now a ghost town of Fairview, then a bona fide mining town, looked at Fairview, decided in the late 1890s that maybe Fairview wasn't going to go, and then he heard about Copper Mountain and the Similkameen and Headley, and a new place called Olalla, which they had high hopes for Olalla, which was just up from where Keremeos is now. So he decided came over the hill, saw several hundred acres, bought those acres, and turned it into a town site. He had it all surveyed, and he had high hopes, Mike, because he surveyed a town site of many, many blocks, 1,000 lots. Figure there were going to be 5,000 people in this area. And he was such a dreamer and interesting man because he was able to convince others. He convinced the Innes family and the Barcelos and several other businessmen that this was the place to be in the Similkameen area.
And they set to it to make it work.
Yeah, and here's
the entire town turned out for this?
Well, yeah, that's probably pretty close to it. About 50 or 60 people in the town. Keremeos Hotel. This is the Barcelos Hotel. There was another hotel, the Kirby's Hotel, Kirby General Store, and the old Palace Livery Stable. This is by the Innes family, and that's in Upper Keremeos as well.
Another great shot of all the freighters going through
Sure,
there.
And the stagecoach right in the background there. Very interesting stuff. And this is one of the general stores that was later abandoned, turned into a schoolhouse, and all these kids there, mostly Barcelos and Kirby's and other families that lived there. But what really happened, Mike, is it started to slip. And partly because the big rush to Olalla, he expected a boom, and all he heard was a shh. That's all he heard.
Deflating sound.
That's right. The air was coming out of this rush. And so the result was that that began to decline. But before it did, and it's rather sad, is that the Kirby still felt that it would make a town site, so they donated several acres of land for a cemetery. And the very sad thing about it was that the first burial in that cemetery was George Kirby's own daughter, Louise Kirby. And she had married one of the Barcelos, died at 20 years old, and is buried in that cemetery, which still exists today.
The cemetery's still there.
That's right. And the old town site itself is virtually gone. All there is an alfalfa field owned by the Coleman family. Yeah. And, you know, that's kind of interesting in itself because the Colemans were there early, and when I was there 30 or 40 years ago, Mike, what happened was that all you saw was a few foundations, cement foundations as well, and big heaps where there were broken bottles and all sorts of bottles. This is one of the bottles from the Keremeos area. Very rare.
And you picked that up in the 50s?
That came out of there in the 50s, yeah.
before it declined, it perked along there. You were telling me about some expensive horseflesh.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were still individuals. There were a lot of ranchers coming into the area. Barrington Price was still there, and they had
The grist mill owner.
That's right. He owned the grist mill in Keremeos itself, or upper bench in Keremeos, and it's still standing, by the way, that original grist mill. And he was a great fancier of horseflesh, and he decided to challenge his horse's mountain chief, and there was another horse known as Bulgar Dick.
Bulgar Dick.
Bulgar Dick, very strange name. And they were considered almost a match. And so this was touted far and wide, the great Sinilkameen Stakes race between Bulgar Dick and Mountain Chief. And in that country, there wasn't a lot of money in that country at that time, so people brought, if they were backing Mountain Chief, they brought a rifle or some furs or anything. The Indians bought a lot of things, and there was a bit of cash changing hands, some gold coin changing hands, and there was a lot of money bet on the outcome. And the outcome was that Mountain Chief just barely edged out Bulgar Dick. And of course, the great benefactor of that, of course, was our friend Barrington Price. And it rather interesting because he had stirrups evidently made of solid silver.
This man was a prince among horsemen.
Well, sure he was.
Yeah.
He was a very interesting character.
This kind of a race, the story of it ran far and wide, did it?
Yeah,
I mean,
it did.
It was the cause célèbre of the time.
Well, sure. It went by telegraph all through actually trail telegraph or moccasin telegraph all through the interior that this was the great race of the South Country, and it was indeed for its day.
Okay, but decline struck. Poor Kirby's dream was worth naught.
Yeah, it starts to turn to dust, but you know that isn't the end of that particular area, because about half a mile away, about half a mile south, another town site comes into being, and the interesting guy there is a guy who's larger than life. This is Halliburton Tweddle.
Halliburton Tweddle.
Yeah, he wasn't known as Halliburton. He insisted on being
guess.
called Harry Tweddle.
Okay.
And here is Harry Tweddle with a stagecoach standing to the left-hand side. And big man, people never forgot him. Many people in Keremeos still talk about Harry Tweddle. Very interesting guy, a fancy guy, a bit of a gambler, a little bit of a ladies' man. Interesting history indeed. And this is his first hotel. This is the Grand Central Hotel. And it is indeed quite a structure. And there's Harry again on the right-hand side, stagecoach mud wagon coming in. And this was the first Central Hotel built in 1902. I believe it burned in 1904, and the second one replaced it. And this was
Bigger
still standing.
And better and more elaborate.
Sure, this is 3 stories. And this hotel stood till the 1950s, Mike. I tried to save this hotel, was unsuccessful. But what happened, some of it was saved, because the bar that came out of this hotel with the brass rail and the spittoons, they all went to the Devonian in Calgary. So they really stayed in Canada.
So if we were to go to the Devonian, we'd be able to put our foot up on the Central Hotel's brass rail?
Oh, sure. Very, very nice indeed. It brings back a lot of memories.
Maybe we could get them to redonate it to a museum that might be in the southern part of the Okanagan. Who knows what the chances are?
I doubt they do this, but you know, this particular part of the valley was really fascinating because there were some really interesting characters in it. There was a guy called, his name was Francois Surprenant.
Francois Surprenant.
He called himself Frank Surprise. You know, that's kind of nice.
It is.
And there was Jackass Lewis, so named because he had a string of jackasses. So what else are you going to call a guy who owns a string of jackasses? Jackass
I think I call him Mr. S or something.
Yeah. And another guy who was very interesting was the Chief Ashnola John. And Ashnola, and he was a very interesting guy. And his headstone is still at the edge of that main street. And this was a very tough character in his youth, because when some of those miners went along that trail up into the Caribou, we know that he took some scalps, because at his cabin, which was at Ashnola Gap, just up from Keremeos, upriver from Keremeos, there were 7 or 8 scalps hanging in there, and several of them were blonde. So he was a very, very truculent sort of individual.
Truculent. This is a great old rifle. This is what kind of a percussion cap?
Yeah, that's probably about 1820, 1830, Mike, somewhere in there.
Now, this copper on this side, that's not the way the rifle was originally established, I would take it.
Oh, no, that's a patchwork there, and what it is really is, usually they patched with leather, but I guess they didn't have leather, or they had a spare piece of copper, and really when they mended with copper, that's really quite rare indeed.
Little mend here. This is not obviously this old wood screws.
That's
now holds the action together.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting carving on the butt as well of this gun. You can see that somebody has I guess hammered some of these designs in here.
Sure they have. Yeah, and there's actually a date very faintly You can very faintly see it there. It's 1861, and the name of a guy called Noel, which is kind of interesting.
Noel.
Yeah.
A big old rifle that somebody like Ashnola John might have been using on a regular basis.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. He would have used this type of rifle. But, you know, not only were there interesting characters like Ashnola John and Frank Surprise and Jackass Lewis, but there were some interesting animals up there. And I talked to a few people in Keremeos about maybe a month ago, and there was a famous ram up in the top there called Billy Bunter.
A real, honest-to-goodness ram.
And there were 75-year-olds and 80-year-olds in Keremeos that remember him well, because when they came home from a little school up there was a jailhouse and a school and a hotel and a livery stable and a blacksmith shop and everything up in Keremeos Center. And when they came home from school, Billy Bunter would be waiting. And he'd knock each one of those kids down in turn. And he was a really bad business. Why they didn't dispatch him, I don't know. And there was a very funny story, because there's a woman called Mrs. Knudsen who came from the Lower Valley. And she was terrorized by Billy Bunter. And she used to have to, when she stayed in the hotel, she would have to go out and get her horse, which is in the livery stable. So she would have to run for it, and she would look around. She wouldn't see Billy Bunter at all. So she'd run for it, and she'd have to jump over the fence. So she'd jump over the fence, drop on the other side. Billy Bunter was there waiting for her. Knock her down every time. Every time. Of course, great joke with the local people. But, you know, Billy Bunter wasn't the only character in that area. And I haven't got the details of this, and I had made note of it some years ago. There was a famous dog in that area, and he was owned by a rancher. And this dog was a pretty smart dog, and his owner was pretty proud of him. And he was showing off one day. The owner had a friend there who he wanted to impress, and he said to his dog, go get the... And he had a bunch of wood in front of him. He said, go get the saw. And the dog went off to the shed about 50 or 100 yards away and brought back a saw. Looked at the dog, and he says, hey, you darn fool. He says, I'm cutting big wood here. He says, I don't need a Swede saw. He says, I need a bigger saw. He says, I need a crosscut. Dog looks at him, cocks his ear, puts the saw down, goes back, picks up the crosscut.
Brings it back out. If you remember the name of this dog, get this. That reminds me of the Bowser Hotel. No, but that'll be another story for another time. So interesting characters and interesting animals, and all of it in the folklore, the legend of the time. Right? We've still got it.
Oh yeah,
People still remember. Last month they remember Billy Bunter.
Yep. Still remember Billy Bunter with absolute clarity.
What happened to Halliburton Tweddle's dream?
Well, Halliburton Tweddle didn't realize his dream either. What had happened, really, was there's something looming on the horizon. The guy looming on the horizon is the empire builder, James Jerome Hill.
The builder of the Great Northern Railway, and this is it in Keremeos.
Yeah, this is part of his great plan, his grand plan west. You know, capture the Kootenai country and the mineral riches, capture the mineral riches of the Boundary country, now capture the mineral riches of Copper Mountain and Headley, and perhaps Olalla.
Yeah.
And then drive an 8-mile tunnel through the Coast Range and go on to Vancouver, and he's the railroad king of British Columbia.
And on the way, he destroyed little puny dreams like Kirby's and Halliburton Tweddle's, but
sure he did.
He went churning through.
Yeah, they fell by the way.
We've got some great artifacts of the Great Northern. Where would you find a lamp like this hanging?
Out of Keremeos. Got it out of Keremeos about 20 years ago, Mike. Yeah. And very nice Great Northern lamp, station house lamp.
Got GN Railway, right?
Yeah.
Right embossed right on it there.
And really, that was the VV&E, Mike. That was the Vancouver Victorian Eastern, which essentially was a Great Northern subsidiary line.
Yeah. And what function would this particular lamp have? What would its job be?
Well, it would be hanging on the station house, and then as the trains came in, they knew if it was red, they didn't move any farther, and if it was blue, they could keep on going.
They could turn on.
Sure.
Too. We've got a little Chinaware, too, because Mr. Hill wanted his railway to be every bit as snazzy as the CPR.
Yeah. And the difference with Hill was he paid all his own way. He got no land grants, no cash grants. So
when he put the money in, it came out of his pocket.
You bet it did.
How much was he worth?
Millions and millions and millions at his death.
In 1900 terms.
Yeah, in 1900 terms. A lot of money.
So that would just sit there on the table with the silver on either side and the linen.
Sure.
It's every bit as impressive as CPR. When people say they rode the CPR because of the great service, his was just as good.
Yeah, and that logo on the side of the Great Northern cars with the mountain goat, you know, really quite marvelous.
Just zoomed along.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So here we have James J. and the Great Northern chuffs into Keremeos.
Yeah, and really what is happening in Keremeos, there are a number of buildings sitting there. This is one, the Keremeos Hotel, and this is kind of a fascinating photograph because there is the biggest guy in the photograph, of course, is Harry Tweddle. And etches the old postmaster from Keremeos Center, he's up there too, and maybe several other local individuals. And the stagecoach is coming through, Mike. It's coming through from Penticton because there's no railroad into Penticton. This is taken around 1910, 1911, and it cuts through Olalla and picks up some mail there, and it cuts through Keremeos and picks up some mail there, and then they bring it down into Keremeos proper, and then you saw some mail in the front, and you also saw in the background an old Cadillac car, and that's what's going to take the place of the old stagecoach. Yeah. So really the stagecoach is on its way out, but there were, Billy Esterbrooks, as I mentioned before, had ridden on that stagecoach. She's in her 80th year in Summerland, and she looks at that stagecoach. She was there.
Isn't it great to still have that connection? Billy Esterbrooks still alive, able to talk to her about all these things?
Oh, sure.
Look at town. This is Keremeos circa 1900?
About 1911, 1912. It's getting established, Mike. The main street is starting. There's a dirt road leading from there to Headley. There are a dozen businesses in town. By the way, on that dirt road, they had a one-man crew. One-man crew was Old Man Dundas. And Old Man Dundas, he took care of all that road, all by his little self, with a wheelbarrow, a pick and shovel, and a rake. And once in a while, they call in the heavy equipment, which was a horse and wagon.
And he would treble that, and that's basically did.
Sure.
Pothole Dundas, or Old Man Dundas.
Yeah, Old Man Dundas. And of course, there were a number of people in Keremeos. There were ranchers, and there were miners. Chinese community, too, I mean, there was a guy called Little Chu, and a guy called Lee Singh, and...
was it a big Chinatown there? Because very often Chinatowns...
Yeah, probably half a dozen buildings at its height. And
a tong or a...
yeah, so there were a lot of interesting characters coming into town. One of the most interesting characters is a story I'm trying to get all the details on now, and I've got some of the details. We have some documentation. About 1907, there was a gunfight in Keremeos. And what happened was an American bad man had drifted in with the Great Northern Cruise. And they quite often did, followed the head of rail, you see, and he came into Keremeos and began to throw his weight around, beat up a couple of the young guys in Keremeos, and finally a rancher heard about this. He drifted back into town, and he challenged this guy to a fight, all right, with lead. So they paced off on the main street, just to the other side of the CPR station. Yeah, here's the view right here. And this is one just on the other side of it, and they were about 60 feet apart. Each fired a number of shots. American didn't hit his mark once. The rancher from Keremeos got him 3 times. American toppled over in the dust. They dragged him off. He survived for 4 days. Now, this is clearly a case of murder, Mike. But how do you get out of it? Well, they called in the local doctor, Dr. R.B. White. And he told this story to Dr. John Gibson, who's in Penticton right now, old friend of mine. And so Dr. White said, well, we had a real problem. He said, we had to get out of it somehow, because nobody liked the American. They were glad he was gone. They didn't want to jail the rancher. So they came up. Verdict from the coroner's jury was that the wounds were not grievous enough to cause instant death, so therefore he died of natural causes. Case closed.
And in a jury of his peers, he was exonerated.
Sure he was.
What a story. Yeah. Gunfight in Keremeos. There weren't many gunfights in British Columbia, it strikes me.
Well, a few more than you realize, but not nearly as much as in the American West. Northwest Mounted Police and the Provincial Police did a fine job.
And thank goodness for friendly coroners who knew the way in.
Weave around it.
Take a break here. Be back in a second because Keremeos is fascinating and it has additional stories, and we'll get into a couple of those in just a moment. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, taking a look at Keremeos today. There's Keremeos. What era?
Well, 1920s, Mike, probably around 1925, 1926. And Keremeos has developed into quite a little town. It's essentially a ranching community, a little bit of mining going down. Not very much, really. Basically, orchards and ranching, ranchers in the lower valley. And, kind of interesting, because I got a story out of there, and John Gibson is pretty familiar with
Dr. John again.
Dr. John in Penticton, a rancher up the valley. They all know this story. And the interesting part of the story is this, Mike, is that when I went down on the U.S. side and did some work down there around places like Nighthawk and Orville and Loomis in there, I got the same story. Very little changed. And this is the story. And it's kind of interesting because it really involves the Canadian side, both on the U.S. side and the Canadian side. They said this lost mine was on the Canadian side. And if you go in that Chapaka area, the Chapaka is the old Indian reserve away down the Similkameen on the west side of the Similkameen.
Past Costin, south of Costin?
That's right, south of Costin by quite a bit. Very close to the international line and very close to the old town of Nighthawk. And if you look at that area, there was the old Utica mine across the valley, which used to be the Horn Silver, and now it's called Danco. And then across the U.S. side, you had a mine at a little place called the Ruby Mine. You had a bunch of other silver mines in there. Well, this is the silver mine, and, you know, it was very high-grade silver, indeed high-grade silver, like that piece you have there.
This is a piece of galena.
That's a piece of galena.
Make somebody rich.
Yeah, and what happened was this, in 1893, and this is the date we come down with from both sides, about 1893, two American prospectors were traveling a high trail, and it came up off that Chopaka Reserve, and they were going over to the Hope Princeton. Now, there were a number of high trails through that country, Mike, quite a few of them, actually, and they decided to take this high trail, and they were going along the trail. They had one pack horse with them, and they noticed fairly within sight of that trail a terrific, and the light just caught it right, a terrific vein of high-grade galena. Well, they stopped naturally and picked away what they could, decided it was so rich that they would take it back to Montana, which they did. And there were smelters in Montana at that time, around Butte and Anaconda. So they took all they could carry on this pack horse, which would be several hundred pounds, that's all, took it back to Montana, had it smelted, and that's in that Sausat Creek, that area in there. And it's somewhere in between probably Ashnola Gap and the lower part of Chopaka. And they waited a year, though, Mike. And what had happened then, terrifically devastating forest fire cut through that country, which occasionally did happen. I mentioned this in the Northport story, some time ago. And this is precisely what happened there. And when a forest fire cuts through country like that, what you have is a complete change in all the landmarks. The country doesn't look the same. It's a barren country, and it throws you off. It even throws experienced woodsmen off. So they came back in looking for it again. Were not able to find it. And a number of individuals since that day have looked for this lost mine. And the Indians used this trail for years, you know. So, but the trouble is there are 3 or 4 trails through there, and now mostly that's grown up. So where is the lost silver mine of the Chopaka?
Well, it's sitting right there, Juniper Creek or someplace like that, and you can just walk right by it.
Sure, it could be at Joe Lake, it could be at Sausat Creek, it could be at Juniper Creek. All those names come up somewhere in that area.
Have you wandered by there, Bill? I mean, just when you had nothing else to do, did you just wander that high trail once?
Mike, I've gone looking for treasure trove, and I've occasionally been relatively lucky. I don't, however, wander through that high country because there are too many variables in this story. You know, I mean, when you're looking down on that South Similkameen country, you've got a vastly different territory. You know, you've got the high country on the west side, and that Okanagan Range, and down on the valley floor you have the desert country and then high country on the other side as well. And it's really quite a fascinating country. One of my favorite parts of the province, I like the Similkameen River, and I like the whole feel of that country down there. You know, I often, when I drive along the highway, for instance, between Keremeos and Headley, I'll see cars whizzing by me, and they don't even realize that you stop, and we talked about the old logo of the Great Northern. The Great Northern's logo was beautiful because it was in blue and white, and there was a mountain goat right in the middle of the logo perched up, and this is mountain goat country. And you can stop there, and quite often I've counted over 100 mountain goats within eyesight of the highway, and people just going by click, 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 not realizing what this country has to offer.
Yeah. The Keremeos columns are in that area, too.
Sure they are.
Those huge slides. You can never imagine talus slides that come down there. And now, of course, they call the town under the K because of the way the talus has come down there and formed that kind of K on the mountain.
That's kind of late, but that's true. So you have the Keremeos column, you have the mountain goats, you have the covered bridges, you have the old VV&E right-of-way, and you have, you know, fascinating country. You're walking on the rooftop of America there in many places.
And riches like galena and silver, maybe by a trail. Our story's been on Keremeos today, 3 Keremeoses. Join us next time as we venture into other gold trails and ghost towns. Bye-bye.